What is going on, chess YouTube? So, Magnus just played a masterpiece in the Catalan Opening against Nihal Sarin in the 2024 Tata Steel Tournament, and in this video, we're breaking it all down. And here we go. In the game, Magnus does open 1d4, Nihal Sarin goes knight to f6, then we have c4 and e6, and now here, of course, Magnus has many different options. Knight to c3, knight f3, and g3 are the main lines. In the game, he does go knight to f3, allowing the queen's gambit decline with the move d5, and that is what Nihal goes for in the game. So, d5 on the board, and now, once again, Magnus, his two main choices are knight to c3 and g3, intending the Catalan Opening, and in this game, he does go for the Catalan, g3 on the board. Magnus has been playing quite a bit of the Catalan Opening lately, so very interesting to see how he plays it in this game. Now here, Nihal, he goes for one of the main lines as black, that is simply bishop b4, putting the king under a check, and forcing out either knight c3, bishop d2, or knight d2. Now here, of course, the main line for white is going to be bishop d2, blocking the check with the bishop, and the main line does continue bishop e7, then bishop g2, and both sides do castle. Now, instead of that in this game, Magnus, he does go for a sideline. He plays the move knight b to d2, a very interesting choice, blocking the check with the knight, and if black goes d takes c4, he will have the option of recapturing with the knight later in the game after he does castle. Of course, this move is not nearly as strong as bishop d2, and the drawback of this move is here black can go d takes c4 immediately, followed by a very fast b5, trying to hang on to that extra pawn, and of course, knight takes c4 immediately is not possible, as that knight on d2 is pinned to the king by the bishop. So, that being the drawback, but in this game, Sarin, he does go for a more solid idea. That is simply the move short castles. So, getting his king to safety, and he doesn't want to imbalance the game too much against Magnus. Magnus, of course, is looking for an imbalanced game where he can play for a win as white. Now here, Magnus, bishop g2 is the move, the standard Catalan move, and now that bishop on g2 is an absolute monster slicing across this diagonal if the game ever opens up. Now here, Sarin, once again, he has the option of playing d takes c4, however, that was not his game plan in this game. Instead, b6 is the move, a more solid choice, intending bishop b7 and trying to keep that pawn on d5 as long as he can. He thinks with that pawn on d5, his game will be a little more solid, but of course Magnus will have his own ideas in this game. Now here Magnus castles on the board, and then bishop b7 is the move. And now here Magnus, he has to find a good follow-up plan. He has castled, all of his pieces are on good squares, but what's it going to be now? Well, the computer finds many different good ideas. For example, knight to e5, jumping in with the knight, and pinning that pawn on d5 to the bishop on b7. Therefore, d takes c4 would not be a possibility. Overall, knight to e5 is very strong. You can also go, say, queen to c2, e3, and so on. But instead, in the game, Magnus, he does play b3, intending the double fianchetto setup, with this bishop going to b2 as well. Now here's Sarin. He has a big choice. You can immediately try to so-called punish this move with the move bishop to c3. A very interesting choice, putting pressure on that rook on a1 and capitalizing on the newly weakened c3 square. Of course, that b-pawn no longer guards c3. Of course, the move bishop c3 is not forced here, and in the game, Sarin does go knight b to d7, arguably a safer and more solid move. Now, Magnus, bishop b2 is the move, guarding c3. Now, bishop c3 is not a possibility, and Sarin, once again, he has many different ideas. For example, rook e8 is good, rook c8, a5, even knight to e4, jumping in with the knight and guarding that e4 square with the knight is very playable. In the game, he does go rook to e8, a very simple choice, and it turns out there are many different ideas behind this move. For example, the f8 square is now vacated, therefore bishop f8 is a possibility, and beyond that, if Magnus ever goes c takes d5, then after e takes, the e file will be opened up, and the rook will be perfectly placed on e8. So Sarin so far playing a fantastic game, playing very, very solid against Magnus. Now here Magnus, he finds the best move by far, rook to c1, just lining up the rook with the c file. Of course, c takes d5 may be coming soon, and if that is the case, then the rook on c1 will be perfectly placed. All right, now here's Sarin. He continues his very solid idea, bishop to f8, retreating the bishop. Now all his pieces are very, very well placed, but his position is a little bit passive. And here Magnus, he does find a way to increase the pressure. He takes on d5 immediately, c takes d5 is the move, and now Sarin does have a very big choice. What do you recapture with, the knight, the bishop, or the pawn on e6? It turns out all of these moves are playable. You can recapture with basically whatever you want here. In the game, Sarin does go bishop takes d5, a perfectly fine move. And now here, of course, e4 is not possible yet, as both the bishop and the knight do control that square. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he his main idea is to guard that e4 square once again and threaten e4. So rook e1 and queen c2 are both very playable. In the game, Magnus does go rook to e1, developing the rook on the e file, and again threatening e4, then e5. Now here's Sarin. He has to guard that e4 square once again, and the right move is knight to e4 in the spirit of the queen's Indian defense. However, he doesn't play that. In the game, he does simply go c5, breaking on the queen side. And don't get me wrong, this is a very standard idea in the Catalan and the Queen's Gambit decline for black, and putting pressure on that pawn on d4, but here it turns out to be a very significant mistake. Here Magnus, he turns up the pressure in the center. e4 is the move, gaining space, and of course driving back that bishop on d5. Where's it going to go? In the game, bishop b7 is the move, the most solid square for the bishop, but now Magnus, e5 is the move, gaining space in the center and putting pressure on that knight on f6. Where's the knight going to go? Here Sarin finds the best square. Knight to d5 is played in the game, but now Magnus, he has that pawn wedge on e5, and he's going to have excellent attacking chances on the king's side. For example, the knight may come to e4, then to g5. He may go h4, maybe queen c2 or d3 at some point in the future. Again, Magnus will have a ton of different attacking ideas. Now, in the game, he starts with a very strong move, knight to e4, jumping in with the knight. And beyond all the threats on the king's side, Magnus is threatening knight to d6, jumping in with the knight into enemy territory. And after bishop takes d6, then e takes, black will be missing his dark squared bishop, and that will be a massive problem for Nihal Sarin in this game. All right, from here, what should the super grandmaster Sarin be doing? Well, it turns out if you wait, let's say you play a waiting move like h6, then knight d6 will be extremely dangerous. Again, even after bishop takes e takes, Magnus will be doing excellent. So with that in mind here, Sarin, he has to find a good response immediately. In the game, he does go rook to c8, lining up the rook on the soon-to-be open c-file, an excellent idea. But here, Magnus, he is ready for this move, and he finds a move that really impressed me during this game. I would have thought, say, knight d6 immediately, or maybe h4 or queen to e2 would be the move. But instead here, Magnus, he plays a very typical Magnus move, knight f to d2, retreating the knight, and setting up ideas like knight c4 and then knight d6. And if he gets that move in with a knight defended on c6 or d6, sorry, by the other knight, that would be an absolute disaster for Sarin. He would be under a tremendous amount of pressure. So with that in mind, you have to do something immediately here as black. All right, again, if you play a waiting move, say h6, then knight c4 is coming. Therefore, in the game, Sarin, he plays the move b5, and this is a very double-edged decision. First of all, you are guarding the c4 square, therefore knight c4 is not a possibility. However, beyond that, all the pawns on the queen side, especially those pawns on b5 and c5, are significantly weakened. And here Magnus, he doesn't slow down. He just jumps in with the knight. Knight to d6 is the move, forking both the rook on e8, the rook on c8, and the bishop on b7. Therefore here, of course, bishop takes d6 is immediately forced. There is just nothing else. So bishop takes d6 played in the game. Now we have e takes d6, and now Magnus does have that pawn on d6, that pass pawn. If he can defend it, that will be a huge asset in the game. All right, Nihal Sarin, what should he be doing right here? Well, the strongest idea is simply c takes d4, forcing bishop takes, and then going e5, gaining some space in the center. If he played that, he would have had much better fighting chances, but instead in the game, he makes a mistake. He simply plays the move c4, gaining space on the queen side, but this turns out to be quite a bit weaker. Here, Magnus, he just takes on c4 twice. B takes, and then, of course, knight takes c4, and now look at this. That pawn on d6 is defended by the knight on c4, and black doesn't have a dark squared bishop to challenge that knight. This is becoming a massive problem. All right, here, Nihal Sarin, if he doesn't find the right move, then knight to e5 will be coming. For example, if he goes h6, then knight e5 will be incredibly dangerous, and if black takes the knight on e5, then d takes e5 would be the move, and Magnus would have that protected pass pawn on d6. That would just be too much. So with that in mind here, Nihal Sarin, he challenges the knight immediately. Knight 7 to b6 is the move, putting pressure on that knight on c4. Of course, Magnus will have to respond, and in the game, he does not go knight to e5. Very importantly, that move does not work here. Here's how it works. If you go knight to e5, then the sequence for black is rook takes c1, then queen takes, and then queen takes d6. Black wins back the pawn, and he would have a perfectly fine game. So instead here, Magnus, he does go knight to a5, putting pressure on the bishop on b7, a very strong move. and now the bishop must move. Here, bishop a6 is the move, putting pressure on this diagonal, but now Magnus, he's not slowing down. Bishop to a3 is the move, defending the pawn on d6, and now again, that pawn on d6 is a defended pass pawn. That is going to be a massive nuisance for black in this game. All right, here, Sarin, he blockades the pawn. Queen d7 is the move, a solid choice, but Magnus, bishop c5, blocking the c-file and keeping all of the rooks on the board for now, a very strong idea. Now, black, a6, a waiting move, giving the king some lofts in the future and potentially guarding g5 if Magnus ever threatens that. But now Magnus here, he has the entire game on lockdown. That pawn on d6 is permanently defended by the bishop on c5. For example, if black ever takes that bishop, say knight takes c5 somehow in the future, then d takes c5, and he would have two defended pass pawns in the center. That would be too much. So here, Magnus, he's not in any rush. He just slow plays the game. He starts with the move h3, a very solid choice. Now black, rook e d8, and then Magnus, queen d2, connecting those rooks finally on the first rank. Now Sarin, he is done waiting. He knows if he waits, Magnus will increase the pressure, say, I don't know, bishop f3, king g2, h4, and so on. He'll just slowly increase the pressure. Therefore, he does go for an active move on the queen side. He plays the move queen to a4, flying in with the queen, and of course now he does have pressure on that pawn on a2 and the pawn on d4. Now here, Magnus, bishop e4 is the move, lining up threats on this diagonal, and Nihal Sarin, he's having none of it. Knight to f6 is the move, pushing back that bishop. Of course, you cannot lose that Catalan bishop here. That will be a major loss. So Magnus does retreat, bishop f3, and now here, Sarin, knight to d5 once again. So Sarin showing he has no real active plan in this position. He's just repeating moves, but Magnus Carlsen doesn't mind. He goes king g2, improving the placement of his king, and the game goes on. Now here's Sarin, queen d7, flying back with the queen, and Magnus h4. The alpha 0 h-pawn has entered the game, or the ginger GM h-pawn, as someone corrected me in the comments recently, but I'll call it the alpha 0 pawn. All right, here, Sarin, bishop b5, trying to reroute the bishop back to c6 potentially, but now Magnus, bishop a3, finally opting for that rook trade on the c-file if Sarin wants it. Now here, rook takes c1 is playable, but after rook takes c1, Magnus is doing excellent. Instead, knight to c4 is the move, forking both the queen on d2 and the bishop on a3. And of course, if Magnus wants to keep that dark square bishop alive, he must go knight takes c4. That's what's played in the game. So, knight takes, then bishop takes, and now Magnus, he just doubles up rook on the c-file. Rook c2 is the move, intending rook e to c1, and he will have tremendous pressure here. All right, Sarin, knight to f6, trying to defend, and now rook e c1 as promised by Magnus. Now the threat is simply rook takes c4, and Sarin will have to respond, and in the game he does go bishop d5, offering the trade of bishops. Now here, Magnus, he does take the bishop on d5 first. Bishop takes d5 is the move, and of course here, if Sarin takes on c2, he will give up control of the d-file. That would be a mistake, but that is what's played in the game. Rook takes c2 is the move, then queen takes, and then knight takes d5. However, here Sarin, again, he surrenders total control of the c-file. For that reason, with the rook still on the board, knight takes d5 immediately would have been the right idea for Sarin. But now here, Magnus, queen to c6, flying in with the queen. The queen is just tremendously active on c6. And here the queens are going to come off the board, and Magnus will have a very good Catalan endgame. All right, here, Sarin, should he take on c6 or develop? It turns out f6 immediately is the right idea. That way, if queen takes d7, then a rook takes, you are in time to go king f7 if rook c8, and you are a tempo up versus the game. But instead, in the game, queen takes c6 was played by Sarin, and now after rook takes c6, now here f6 is the right move for Sarin. But again here, Magnus is up one tempo versus the immediate c6 instead of queen takes c6. Now here, Magnus, bishop c5, putting pressure on that pawn on a7, an excellent idea. Rook d7 does defend, but now Magnus once again, rook to a6, a very simple but strong idea, putting more and more pressure on that pawn on a7. And how will Sarin respond? In the game, knight to b6 is the move, defending the pawn indirectly. Of course, the bishop is not attacking the pawn right now, but here Magnus, he's not done. a4, expanding on the queen side. The threat is simply a5, removing the blockade of that pawn on a7. So Magnus playing very simple but very strong chess here. All right, Sarin, king to f7 is the move. Now a5 for Magnus, and now the knight must move. In the game, knight to c4 is the move, putting pressure on the pawn on d6. This way, if, say, bishop takes d6, then knight takes d6 could be a good response. So Magnus, with that in mind, he doesn't take a pawn yet. He just improves the placement of his king. King to f3. And here, if Sarin takes his sweet old time, then Magnus will go king to e4, then king to d3, putting pressure on that knight, and Sarin's position would collapse. So with that in mind, here Sarin, he does counterattack in the center immediately. The move is e5, gaining space, but now Magnus, d5, not opting to trade pawns, instead keeping 2 passed pawns on the d-file. Now here's Sarin, f5, trying to get some form of counterplay. His threat may include e4 and just pushing his kingside pawn majority down the board. But now here Magnus, he is done waiting. He takes on a7. Rook takes, then bishop takes is the sequence. And now Sarin does take on a5. Knight takes a5. But here Magnus, again, a brilliant idea. Simply d7. And now a threat, for example, if king to e7 would be d8, promoting to a queen, knowing if you take the new queen, then bishop b6 forks both the knight and the king. So Magnus here with a very deadly threat. Sarin will have to respond properly. And in the game, he does. Knight to b7 is the move, the better defensive idea. But now Magnus, another brilliant move, bishop c5. The idea being, if knight takes c5, then again d8 will be an undefended square, and Magnus would get a new queen. So here, Magnus just playing with his food in the endgame. All right, here, Sarin, g6 is the move, defending f5 preemptively, not a bad idea. But here, Magnus, once again, he's not in any rush. He just slides over his king, king to e3, then king to f6, and then here, bishop to f8, putting pressure on that pawn on the h6 square. Now here's Sarin, he spots the threat, and he does go king to f7, putting pressure on the bishop. And now the idea, if you go bishop takes h6, then the pawn on d7 will fall to, say, king to e7. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he does not take that pawn on h6. Instead, he drops back the bishop. Bishop b4, an excellent move. And now, of course, that pawn on d7 will live for a little while longer. Of course, now the king does not have access to either e8, e7, or e6, as both the bishop and the pawns here control all of these squares. All right, now Sarin, king to f6 is the move, and now king d3 for Magnus. Now g5, gaining space on the king side, again pushing his king side pawn majority down the board. And now Magnus, he does trade on g5, h takes, then h takes, and then king to c4. The king march has begun. Sarin goes e4, pushing his pawn majority, and now Magnus, king to b5, again threatening king to b6 ideas. Now here, knight d8 is the move, jumping back with the knight. But Magnus, king to b6, again the king march. All right, f4 on the board, threatening ideas like e3 and pushing his pawn down the board, trying to promote. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he is ready. G takes f4, then g takes, and then here simply king to c7, again threatening king takes d8. The knight must move. In the game, knight to f7 is the move. And here, the simplest finish in this position is just going to be d8, promoting to a new queen. The idea being after knight takes, then king takes, you can stop those pawns on e4 and f4. Now, instead, in the game, Magnus, he does play a simpler option, simply bishop d2, putting pressure on that pawn on f4. Now, what is Sarin going to do? Of course, e3 does not work. F takes, then bishop takes would win that pawn on the spot. So with that in mind here, king to e5 is the move for Sarin. But now Magnus, d6 on the board, pushing his other pass pawn. Now Sarin, e3 on the board. We have f takes, and bishop takes. And this is going to be too much. Here, Sarin will never be able to sacrifice his knight for one of those pawns, as there will be the second pawn that can promote. So here, Sarin, he goes king d5. But after bishop to f4, here, Sarin, he just resigns on the spot. The threat is d8, promoting to a queen. Then after knight takes and king takes, that pawn on e6, or d6, sorry, will be defended by the bishop. Therefore, Sarin here, he's out of options, and he just resigns on the spot to Magnus. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Nihal Sarin in the 2024 Tata Steel India Tournament in the Catalan Opening. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen plays an unbelievable game against Pragnanda. That was a 28-move masterpiece. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you'll love that one as well. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.